The trash can opens. A hand drops in half a loaf of bread, a few wilted vegetables, a container with leftovers no one felt like eating. The lid closes. And just like that, it's gone. No second thought, no hesitation, no consequence. Now look closer. Because what you just saw wasn't just food being thrown away. It was money. It was time. It was effort. And the most dangerous part? It felt completely normal. Now imagine that same moment. In 1933, a mother stands in a quiet kitchen. The same bread sits in her hands, hard, dry, almost impossible to chew. But she doesn't throw it away. She pauses. She thinks. And then, she transforms it. Because in her world, throwing food away wasn't just wasteful. It was unthinkable. Not because she was more disciplined. Not because she was more skilled. But because she saw something you've been trained not to see. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You're not wasting money because you're careless. You're wasting it because your brain was trained for convenience, not survival. Modern life made things easy, too easy, easy to buy, easy to replace, easy to ignore. And your brain adapted. It learned that throwing something away costs you nothing. So it stopped paying attention. That's the real problem, not your income, not your budget, not your discipline, your perception. Before we go any further, take a second, subscribe to The Lost Taste, and like this video. Because what you're about to learn isn't about saving a few coins. It's about rewiring the way you see everything inside your home. Trick number 1, bacon drippings is no longer seen as waste, but as one of the most valuable cooking assets in the entire kitchen. That fat is strained, stored, and reused to fry eggs, cook vegetables, and even build pie crusts. And this introduces what we call the flavor recycling system, where anything that carries taste must be preserved. Because flavor is not just an addition, it is a multiplier. And once you understand that, you stop discarding things that don't look like food, and start recognizing hidden value in places you used to ignore. And that same thinking expands even further when we look at meat. Because in modern kitchens, meat is often the center of the meal. But in the 1930s, that idea didn't exist because it was too expensive to sustain. So instead of serving meat as volume, they used it as influence. And this is exactly what happens in trick number 2. Meat stretching, where a small portion of ground meat is combined with oats, stale bread, or crushed biscuits to double or even triple its size and feed an entire family. And this creates the volume expansion method, where instead of asking how much you need, you ask how far it can go. And this single shift removes the pressure of scarcity and replaces it with strategy. Because now the goal is not consumption, it is distribution. And once you apply this, your meals stop being limited by what you have and start being defined by how you use it. And this logic leads directly into one of the most surprising creations of the time, something that should not work, but does perfectly, as seen in trick number 3, wacky cake, where there is no milk, no eggs, and no butter, only flour, water, cocoa powder, vinegar, and baking soda. And yet the cake rises, becomes soft, and delivers exactly what is needed, not perfection, but satisfaction. And this introduces a deeper reframe that changes everything. Creativity is not optional when resources are limited. It becomes the resource itself. And once your brain accepts that, it stops depending on ideal conditions and starts building solutions from what is available. And that mindset becomes even more powerful when applied to things that are almost always ignored, like the water used to boil potatoes from trick number 4. Potato water doesn't go down the drain, which today disappears without thought, but in that kitchen is collected and reused because it contains starch that can thicken soups, enrich sauces, and even replace water in bread dough, making it softer and more nourishing. And this reveals the hidden nutrient recovery system, where the process of cooking does not end when the food is removed. It continues in what remains. And once you understand that, you begin to question everything you throw away, because now even liquids are part of the system. And that awareness becomes critical when we look at something as fragile as milk. Because before refrigeration, milk turned quickly, and most people today would see that as the end. But in the 1930s, that moment was not the end. It was the signal to transform, as shown in trick number 5, using sour milk, also known as clabber, where the natural acidity of the milk is used intentionally to create better pancakes, biscuits, and bread. And this creates the pre-waste conversion method, where the goal is not to prevent change, but to anticipate it and act at the exact moment when something is no longer fresh, but not yet lost. And this is where most modern waste actually happens, not because food disappears instantly, but because people miss the moment, where it could still be saved, and once that moment passes, throwing it away feels justified. But what you are starting to see now is that nothing in that kitchen was random. Every action followed a logic of continuation, expansion, and transformation, and what looked like limitation was actually structure. And that structure is what allowed families to survive with less, while wasting nothing. And in the next part, this system goes even further into places most people would never consider, where even something like the hard outer layer of a watermelon becomes a preserved food, as seen in trick number 6, watermelon rind pickles, proving that the line between waste and value is not real. It is simply a matter of how you choose to see it. Once you understand that nothing in the kitchen exists for a single use, the next shift becomes even more uncomfortable, because now you are forced to confront something deeper. The idea that what you have been calling waste was never truly waste to begin with. And this becomes impossible to ignore when you look at something like a watermelon, because today people enjoy the sweet red center and discard everything else without hesitation. But in the 1930s, even the hardest, most unappealing part had purpose, as shown in trick number 6, watermelon rind pickles, where the thick white rind was cut into pieces, boiled with sugar vinegar and spices, and transformed into a preserved food that lasted through the winter. And this is where a new system emerges, what we call the waste reversal method, where the least desirable part of any ingredient becomes the starting point for a completely new use. And once you apply this, your definition of food begins to expand, because now you are no longer selecting only what is pleasant. You are extracting value from what remains, and that same principle becomes even more powerful when combined with time. Because in many cases, value is not immediate, it is developed, and this is exactly what happens in trick number 7, apple peel vinegar, where apple peels and cores, things that are normally discarded, are placed in water with a small amount of sugar and left to ferment slowly over weeks until they transform into a fully usable vinegar. And what this reveals is something most people today struggle with: patience, because modern systems reward speed, but in that kitchen, time itself was a tool. And this introduces the time conversion principle, where something with little value today can become highly valuable if given the right conditions and enough time. And once you understand this, you stop rushing to conclusions about what is useful and what is not, because you realize that usefulness can be created, not just discovered. And this brings us back to something even more familiar but deeply misunderstood: bread. Because when bread becomes hard, most people immediately disconnect from it, seeing it as something finished. But in the 1930s, as seen in trick number 8, stale, bread saves lives. That moment was not an ending. It was a transition point where bread could be grated into breadcrumbs, fried into croutons, turned into pudding, or used to stretch meals further. And this reinforces a powerful reframe: nothing is ever finished. It simply changes form. And once your brain accepts that, it becomes much harder to justify throwing things away. Because now every stage of an ingredient has meaning, and this idea continues even in something as routine as coffee. Because while today it is consumed once and discarded immediately, in the 1930s, as shown in trick number 9, second-run coffee, the used coffee grounds from the morning were not thrown away. They were reused later in the day with a small addition of fresh grounds to create another pot of coffee, weaker, but still satisfying, and this reveals something deeper about human behavior. Satisfaction does not always require abundance. Sometimes it only requires continuation. And this is where the continuity consumption method appears, where the goal is not to maximize intensity, but to extend experience. And once you apply this mindset, your relationship with consumption changes, because you stop chasing perfect results and start appreciating extended value. And this same principle of continuation takes an even more surprising form when applied to living food itself. Because in the 1930s, people didn't just reuse what was left, they regrew it, as seen in trick number 10, replanting. Leftovers on the windowsill, where the root bases of vegetables like celery, chives, and lettuce were placed in water and allowed to sprout again, providing fresh ingredients without additional cost. And this introduces the regenerative food cycle, where the end of one use becomes the beginning of another, not through transformation, but through renewal. And this is where the system reaches a completely different level, because now you are no longer just preserving value, you are creating new value from what already exists. And this is the moment where most people watching will feel a shift, because the question is no longer, what can I afford, but what am I overlooking? And this leads to something you need to answer. Honestly, if you stopped throwing things away for the next 7 days, how much of what you normally waste would actually still have a use? And once you start thinking about that, you realize this is not about learning new tricks. It is about unlearning a pattern that has been guiding your decisions for years. And in the next part, that same pattern extends beyond food into something even more personal. The clothes you wear, where instead of replacing what was worn out, people developed systems to restore reuse and extend the life of everything they owned. Once the mindset of preservation moves beyond the kitchen, it begins to reshape something even more personal, the way people saw what they owned. Because in the 1930s, clothing was not disposable. It was an extension of survival, and every piece carried time, effort, and value, which meant nothing was ever replaced without first being fully exhausted. And this becomes clear when you look at something as simple as a flour sack. Because what most people would see as packaging was transformed into clothing, as shown in trick number 11, feed sack dresses, where cotton sacks that once carried flour or animal feed were washed, cut, and sewn into dresses for children. And over time, companies even began printing patterns on those sacks because they understood that what they were selling would live a second life. And this reveals a powerful shift. Opportunity is not found in what something is, but in what it can become. And once you adopt that mindset, your environment starts to look completely different, because now, even the most ordinary object holds potential. And that same principle continues in something even more subtle, like the wear on a shirt collar. Because today, when clothing shows damage, it is often discarded without hesitation. But in the 1930s, as shown in trick number 12, turning the collar over, that damage was not the end. It was simply a signal to intervene, where the collar would be carefully removed, turned inside out, where the fabric was still intact, and sewn back into place, effectively resetting its lifespan. And this introduces the reversal repair method, where instead of replacing what is worn, you reverse it to access what is still usable. And this idea challenges a deeply ingrained habit, because modern thinking focuses on visible condition, while survival thinking focuses on remaining structure. And once you understand that, you stop reacting to surface damage and start evaluating deeper usability. And this becomes even more precise when we look at something like socks. Because in today's world, a hole means replacement. But in the 1930s, as seen in trick number 13, darning socks, that hole was repaired using simple tools like a darning egg, or even a burnt light bulb to hold the fabric in place, while new thread was carefully woven in, extending the life of the sock for months or even years. And this reveals another system, the structural preservation method, where small damages are addressed early before they expand into total loss. And once you apply this idea, you begin to notice how often things are discarded, not because they are unusable, but because they were ignored for too long. And that awareness shifts your behavior from reactive to preventive. And this pattern continues, even when a garment reaches the point where it can no longer be worn. Because in modern life, that would be the end. But in the 1930s, it was simply another transition point, as shown in trick number 14, the sacred button tin, where every usable component, buttons, zippers, clasps, lace, was carefully removed and stored for future use. And this introduces the component recovery system, where the value of an object is not measured as a whole, but broken down into parts. And once you think this way, nothing is ever truly finished. Because even when something can no longer serve its original purpose, it still contains elements that can be reused, and this idea reaches its final form when we look at what happens to what remains, because fabric that was no longer wearable was not discarded. It was transformed as seen in trick number 15 rag rugs, where strips of old clothing were braided and sewn into thick rugs that insulated homes during cold winters. And this completes the cycle of total transformation, where the end of one use becomes the foundation of another. And this is where the difference between modern consumption and survival thinking becomes impossible to ignore, because today objects move in a straight line from purchase to disposal. But in that world, everything moved in cycles: use, repair, recover, transform, and only then release. And once you see that pattern, you begin to question something deeper. How many of the things you own right now are closer to transformation than replacement? And in the next part, that same principle expands even further into the home itself, where nothing, not even ash paper or string, was ever considered too small to matter. When the mindset of preservation reaches the home itself, something even deeper begins to change, because now it is no longer just about food or clothing. It becomes a way of seeing the entire environment, where nothing is dismissed as too small to matter. And this becomes clear in something as overlooked as leftover fat that could no longer be eaten, because instead of being thrown away, it was transformed into something essential, as seen in trick number 16. Making your own soap, where animal fat was mixed with lye and water and boiled into bars of soap, used to clean clothes, floors, and even people. And this introduces the resource conversion system, where something that has lost its original purpose is redirected into a completely new function. And once you understand this, you stop asking if something is useful and start asking what else it can become. And this same awareness extends into the structure of the house itself, because keeping warmth inside was expensive and required constant effort. So instead of relying only on fuel, people created barriers using what they already had, as shown in trick number 17 newspaper, as thermal insulation, where layers of old newspapers were placed under carpets and stuffed into window gaps to block cold air. And this reveals the environmental efficiency method, where protection is not built only with new materials, but with intelligent use of existing ones. And once you see this, you begin to question how many solutions you overlook simply because they don't look modern enough. And this pattern continues even in something as fragile as paper, because today it is used once and discarded without thought. But in the 1930s, as shown in trick number 18, washing and drying paper, even parchment paper bags and foil, were carefully cleaned, dried and reused multiple times. And this introduces the extended use principle, where the lifespan of an object is not defined by its first use, but by how many times it can still function. And once you adopt this mindset, your consumption slows down, not because you force it, but because you naturally extract more from what you already have. And this same discipline becomes almost symbolic in something as simple as string, because when packages arrived tied with cord, most people today would cut it immediately. But in the 1930s, as seen in trick number 19, the string ball, the knots were patiently untied, and the string was rolled into a growing ball that was used over time for tying plants, securing items, and fixing things around the house. And this reveals the discipline of small things, where value is not measured by size, but by consistency, because it is not one large saving that changes your life. It is hundreds of small decisions repeated over time. And once you internalize that, nothing feels too insignificant to keep. And that leads to one of the most surprising examples of all, because even something as seemingly useless as ash from a stove was not ignored, but used as a cleaning tool, as shown in trick number 20, stovetop ashes as an abrasive, where fine cold ash was mixed with water to create a paste that scrubbed and polished pots without the need for purchased products. And this completes the system of total efficiency, where every output becomes a new input, and nothing leaves the cycle unused. And this is where everything comes together, because what you are seeing is not a collection of tricks. It is a completely different way of interacting with the world, where objects do not move in a straight line from use to disposal, but in continuous cycles of transformation. And once you see that pattern clearly, something shifts inside you, because now when you walk into your kitchen, your home, your daily life, you no longer see things the same way. You stop seeing items as temporary and start seeing them as resources. You stop reacting automatically and start observing intentionally. And that is the moment where control replaces waste. Because now every decision carries awareness. Every object carries potential, and every action becomes deliberate. And this is the transformation from someone who consumes without thinking to someone who extracts value with precision. And the truth is, you don't need more money. You don't need better conditions. You don't need perfect discipline. You need a different lens. Because once you learn to see what was always there, you stop losing what you already have. And if this shifted the way you think, even slightly, then subscribe to The Lost Taste, like this video, and write in the comments, "I see value where others see waste," because that single sentence is not just a comment, it is a decision, and decisions like that repeated over time are what separate those who constantly lose from those who quietly build.